Welcome to Mana's Seal YouTube channel. The previous video link is on the description box or on the top right card. Volume 13, The Paladin of the Holy Kingdom. The third wave came. The ogres were not used to archery, and many of them missed their shots. Even so, many of the battlements crumbled under the third volley, and there were many casualties among the militiamen. The massive lance-like bolts could pierce a man and the man behind him as well. Under Divine Flag was a spell that was centered on the paladin who had cast it, which meant that its effect were strongest when many people were bunched up within its effective radius. However, that only led to more casualties. The sound of flapping came through the air before the enemy could fire a fourth time. Winged angels flew through the sky and passed over the heads of Nia and the others. While they were angels of the lowest order, they headed straight for the Demi-Humans. They had burning brands in their right hands, and they held pitchers with cloths sticking out of their mouths in their left hands. Those pitchers clearly contained oil or powerful spirits. In other words, they were carrying explosive throwing weapons, firebombs. Of course, the flames produced by those weapons would not harm fire-resistant opponents in the slightest, or demi-humans with thick hides or large bodies. They might not even have an effect at all. On the other hand, there were also those demi-humans who could not deal with fire, and damaging the Ballista would also stop the enemy attack. The angels filled the sky above the Ballista-wielding ogres and lit their pitchers. However, they did not even have the time to cast them down. There was a flapping sound as demi-humans stick to the sky. They were pteropuses. Their hands were shaped into leathery wings, and their arms remained still as they rose straight into the air like they were riding the wind. That was probably the effect of some kind of spell. A white web-like substance flew out at the same time, entangling the angels. It had probably been produced by a special ability of the Spidings. The angels looked like butterflies caught in a spiderweb, and they plunged to the ground, since they were unable to move freely. They were swallowed up by the demi-human hordes, and it was needless to say what happened to them after that. However, the angels had not sacrificed themselves in vain. Several firebombs hit the ground, and roaring flames splashed all around. Nia judged that this was the best chance she would get, and tensed her bowstring. Until now, it had been impossible to aim directly at the ogres, due to the shields mounted on their Ballista. Even if she took aim at their unshielded legs instead, it would be nearly impossible to kill them in one hit. Her father would have been able to shoot out an ogre's eye through a tiny opening. However, Nia's skills were not as honed as his. However, the ogres raised their Ballista and pointed their shields upwards. Perhaps it was because they feared the flames or they were afraid for their Ballista, but whatever the reason, their attention was focused on the fire, and they did not pay her any attention. If she missed this chance, she would probably not get another. She drew her bowstring to its limit, and then loosed her arrow. The magic item she had borrowed from the Sorcerer King aided Nia in bringing forth a result that approached what her father could do. The arrow flew on a startlingly straight path, and struck an ogre's head. Nia had not aimed for the thick skull, but a squishy eyeball. While some monsters possessed a protective membrane over their eyes, she judged that it would be easier to strike a fatal blow there, rather than targeting the skull. However, things did not go as planned. Her arrow sank into the vicinity of the ogre's jaw. The stricken ogre howled loudly, shuddering from the pain. The ogre dropped its ballista, and it clutched its face, the part where it had been shot. Then, it shakily turned its back on Nia before falling back. While she had not dealt it a mortal blow, she had at least broken its will to fight. If the demi-human army had healers, it would probably be able to return to the front lines in no time. This was all Nia could accomplish, even with the aid of the powerful magic items the Sorcerer King had lent her. Nia clicked her tongue and immediately took cover behind the battlements, then pressed herself to the city side of the wall and began to move. The militiamen beside her stared in surprise as she suddenly left her post, and she addressed them in harsh tones. "Get out of here. They're going to counterattack this place." It was not because they had heard Nia's shout, but several of the Ballista discharged their projectiles in her direction. While most of the bolts had gone awry, some of them landed in Nia's vicinity, and they wrecked a nearby wall. If Nia had been unlucky, she might well have been impaled by those bolts. She peeked at the demi-humans again. The chaos from the angels and fire attack was being steadily contained, and the ogres raised their Ballista again. It would seem news of being hit by an arrow had spread throughout the enemy army. In that case, they would probably not make the mistake of lowering their shields again. Therefore would she gamble on being able to emulate her father's skill by a stroke of luck, hitting them even if she could only strike their exposed bodies? Or would she shrink up like a turtle and wait for her chance? Amidst her confusion, the bow she had borrowed from the Sorcerer King caught the sun's light and gleamed beautifully. You won't be praised for rashness. Yes. She had managed to borrow such incredibly potent items, and she had to return them no matter the cost. Therefore, she ought not to take risks. They can't have that many special bolts. It would seem the demi-humans were volleying an endless hail of lance-sized bolts at them. However, the crit manufacture meant that very often, they flew towards places with nothing to hit, and some of them even fell into the city streets without striking anything. She could not return fire, so all she could do was hunker down and wait for the enemy attack to stop. Fragments of the destroyed city wall showered near. Some unlucky militiamen were hit and died on the spot, but while others silently prayed for the enemy attack to stop, since they could not do anything else. Soon, she heard a mighty doom, the beat of a drum. The same sound repeated itself 4 times. In the distance, the same sound came from what should have been the left wing of the enemy's formation. They're coordinating their movements with the number of drum beats. It looks like the right and left wings are using that to communicate. If I could enter the enemy camp and steal one of those drums, then beat wildly on it, that ought to disrupt the enemy's cohesion. That said, it would be impossible. The enemy ought to know the importance of their drums. Therefore, they would be heavily guarded. In that case, who could charge into their camp? Perhaps an adventurer could use invisibility or silence or other spells to cause chaos among the enemy, and then sneak in. There's no point hoping for the impossible. Still, there was no doubt that the enemy was changing tack. Nia and many militiamen nervously rose up to peek at the enemy's movements. After that, a great commotion rose up from them. It was a feeling which combined shock, fear, and furious anger. The army arrayed on the other side of the wall was advancing at last. The left and right wings of the Demi-Human alliance forces moved forward in parallel. The center detachment approached the city gate in a layered formation. The Demi-Humans advanced with earth-shaking steps, as though they wanted to hunt down and kill Nia and the others. And then there was another unit, a very small one, which seemed to be flanking the city. Were they planning to scale the walls, or was this a feint? In any case, the enemy had already launched the second wave of their attack. From now on, it would not be a one-sided struggle, but a mutual struggle of savage bloodshed. However, that was not where the problem lay. After all, they had been waiting a long time for this, but they could not take joy in the fact that the time had come at last. What angered the militiamen was the advance of the left and right wings. Their foremost units were composed of many different species. While they lacked a sense of unity, they had 2 things in common. One was that they were all carrying assault ladders. In other words, their unit was meant to scale the walls and break into the city. That also implied that they were Nia's objective. The other thing was that they had human children bound to their bodies. Some of them were crying and wailing, while others hung limp. All of them were naked, and all of them were alive. Nia bit her lip hard. But at the same time, Nia's heart was surprisingly calm. From her darkened nook in the walls, she watched the Demi-Human tide pressing down on them. Nia then slid an arrow out of her quiver, and began to draw her bow. Even if the enemy pioneers had entered her shooting range, she had to hold on. It was still too early. She took several deep breaths, focused herself, then turned as fast as she could, and drew her bowstring taut. She had only a moment to aim, and there was only one point where she could aim. Here. She released her arrow. Her unhesitating shot pierced the human shield, the chest of a child, and the Demi-Human behind it. Perhaps even that powerful shot would have been hard-pressed to bring down something with the toughness of an ogre. However, the Demi-Human she had just hit did not seem to possess such unreasonable vitality. Nia paid no heed to the Demi-Human she had downed and drew another arrow. She had killed a person, the child bound in front of the Demi-Human. Her hands would not stop shaking. Her vision turned black, and her heart trembled. Though she knew this would happen and had prepared herself for it, this was how she had reacted. She reached for the hilt of her sword by force of habit, but her fingers touched the bowstring instead. It was as though her bow was chiding her, telling her that now was not the time for that sort of thing. A faint lamp lighted up in Nia's frozen heart. It spread like wildfire, and dispersed the chill winds blowing through her soul. She stopped shaking, and her vision no longer felt narrowed. What filled her heart were the words of the person who embodied an unshakable justice. Ah, to think it would have such a great effect. Nia confirmed that what the Sorcerer King said had been correct. The Demi-Human pioneers that Nia had attacked were visibly slowing down. That was because they had been shaken to discover that their human shields were not effective. Therefore, she shouted. Nia opened her eyes, and shouted at the staring militiamen. What are you doing? Hurry up and throw your stones down. We can't save those hostages. Indeed. Nia and the others could not save the hostages. And then, they had already seen what the enemy would do to hostages that had lost their value. Therefore, what could they do? She fired another arrow to speed the Demi-Humans on their way to the afterlife. Nia used her practiced vision and saw that her shot had pierced a boy through his forehead. She did not know if it was because she had been aiming for an armlet, or because the boy's skull had lessened the impact, but this arrow had not been immediately fatal. However, the enemy's front line was in chaos. That was only to be expected. Both humans and Demi-Humans would slow their pace when things did not proceed as planned. However, all she could see of the enemy lines stretched from one edge of her vision to the other. Nia had only had an effect on the region where she had shot. Everywhere else, things were continuing as though nothing had happened. It looked like a small dent in a long, long line. Hurry up and throw the stones. Nia shouted at them again. If they did not throw their stones, everything Nia had done would have been for nothing. That was something even more unforgivable than taking the lives of children who had futures ahead of them. The enemy was attacking on the left, right, and center at the same time. A head-on clash with an enemy that outnumbered them several times to one result in them being crushed under the sheer weight of numbers. However, if even one of the enemy elements slowed down, it would relieve the pressure on them. If the enemy reached the walls, they would climb up while using the children as shields. If they managed to make it up the walls, the militiamen would not be able to resist the demi-humans. What she had to do now was see how much fighting strength she could shave off the enemy before they arrived. It's very difficult for militiamen to kill children. Therefore, there has to be someone who's willing to set an example, even if they get their hands dirty. Nia fixed her eyes on a paladin in the distance.